The first time I realized how easily dignity could be stripped from a man was not in a boardroom or a courtroom. It was under crystal chandeliers with a string quartet playing something soft and forgettable, while 200 guests held champagne flutes and waited to laugh. "Ladies and gentlemen," my daughter-in-law said, her voice bright and practiced, "I'd like you to meet the old fat pig we have to put up with." For half a second the room didn't move. Then the laughter came. Not awkward laughter, not nervous laughter, real laughter, comfortable laughter, the kind that assumes permission. I stood there in my dark suit, hands relaxed at my sides, feeling the words hit me like ice water poured down my spine. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I didn't step forward or step back. I just stood still and watched as the people who had eaten my food and danced under a roof I had paid for laughed as if cruelty were a form of entertainment. And then I noticed something strange. Her father stopped laughing. His smile collapsed halfway as if someone had pulled the power from his face. The color drained from his skin. His hand froze in midair champagne glass, trembling just enough to catch the light. Our eyes met across the room, and in that single second something passed between us that no one else understood. Recognition. That was the moment I knew the laughter would not age well. The music resumed slightly off-tempo. Someone clapped, trying to smooth the moment over. A few guests glanced at me, then away, as if embarrassed on my behalf, but unwilling to interrupt the performance. My daughter-in-law kept smiling, proud of her line, pleased with herself. My son stood beside her, stiff and silent. I stayed exactly where I was. This was my only son's wedding. The wedding I had paid for entirely down to the last place card and rose petal. Over $300,000 spent without a single request for acknowledgement. I hadn't written my name on anything. I hadn't insisted on a toast. I hadn't made a speech about sacrifice or love. I had simply written the checks and stepped back, believing that a father's role was to support, not to perform. Apparently that belief had been expensive in ways money couldn't cover. People kept talking. Servers moved through the room as if nothing had happened. Glasses clinked. Laughter swelled again, softer this time, less certain. The insult had already done its work. It didn't need repeating. I watched the room the way I've always watched rooms, quietly, carefully. I noticed who laughed first. The bride's mother, sharp and loud, 2 of her cousins, eager to please, a handful of business associates who didn't want to seem out of step. And then the others, the ones who laughed late after checking faces following the signal that it was safe. Safety has always fascinated me. How quickly people decide where it lies. I felt no urge to defend myself, no surge of anger. What I felt instead was something colder and heavier. Understanding. This wasn't a spontaneous insult born of nerves or too much champagne. This was rehearsed, approved, shared in advance. They believed they knew who I was. I had been introduced throughout the evening in vague, diminishing ways. The groom's father. He keeps to himself, old-fashioned. No mention of contribution, no acknowledgement of presence beyond obligation. I had been edited down to a background character in a story funded entirely by me, and my son had allowed it. I saw him, then really saw him, standing half a step closer to his new wife than to me, his shoulders slightly angled away, his eyes fixed somewhere just above the crowd, as if pretending not to hear could make the moment pass faster. Silence can be louder than words. I learned that lesson long ago, but it had never cut this close. I didn't leave the reception. That surprised some people later when they heard the story secondhand. They expected me to have stormed out, or to have confronted her, or to have made a scene worthy of gossip. But public scenes reward the wrong instincts. They give cruelty the spotlight it craves. So I stayed. I accepted congratulations from strangers who had just laughed at me. I nodded politely at relatives who avoided my eyes. I thanked the catering manager for a flawless evening. I even smiled once or twice, the way you do when you don't want anyone to mistake composure for weakness. Her father didn't approach me again. He hovered at the edge of the room, speaking in low tones, glancing in my direction more than once. The man who had arrived, radiating confidence, now looked like someone who had misplaced something important and was afraid to admit it. Good, I thought. Let it settle. I have spent most of my life letting people believe what they want. I don't correct assumptions unless they matter. I don't introduce myself with titles or numbers. I've learned that the people who ask the fewest questions are usually the most comfortable with their conclusions. They assumed I was harmless, middle-aged, replaceable. A man whose value ended the moment his son stood at the altar. They assumed wrong. But assumptions, like laughter, need time to collapse under their own weight. When the night finally ended and the guests began to drift away, I stood alone for a moment near the edge of the dance floor. The chandeliers dimmed. The quartet packed up their instruments. Someone swept rose petals into neat, anonymous piles. I looked around the room and felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not revenge. Clarity. I had come to this wedding believing that generosity would protect me, that love given freely and quietly would be enough. Standing there, I understood the truth I had avoided for years. Generosity without boundaries doesn't buy respect. It rents contempt. I straightened my jacket, thanked the staff one last time, and walked out into the night without saying goodbye. By Monday morning, the laughter would make sense to them. They just didn't know it yet. The room recovered quickly after the laughter, the way rooms always do when cruelty doesn't interrupt the schedule. Music swelled again. Plates were cleared. Someone tapped a glass and announced the cake. The night continued efficient and well-funded, as if nothing worth remembering had happened. I stayed. That decision surprised even me. Part of me expected my body to move on its own, to turn toward the exit in protest. But it didn't. I remained near the edge of the reception, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, watching the celebration reorganize itself around the insult, as if it were a minor spill someone had wiped away. People spoke to me differently after that. Not openly hostile, not even rude. Just smaller, slower. Voices softened, words simplified, smiles tightened at the corners. A woman I'd never met asked if I was enjoying my retirement. A man clapped me on the shoulder and told me it must be nice to finally relax now that the kids are grown. Another guest leaned in and said kindly, "Weddings can be a lot at your age," as if I might need a chair and a glass of water. At your age? I nodded. I smiled politely. I thanked them for coming. This was the man they thought I was. To them, I was an accessory to the evening, a necessary obligation like a signature at the bottom of a document no one reads. Useful once then, quietly irrelevant. The groom's father. The older man who had done his part and should now step aside. They assumed I had stretched to afford this wedding, that the checks had cost me sleep, that I had written them out of pride or pressure, not capacity. No one asked how I knew the florist by name or why the venue manager deferred to me without hesitation. They didn't wonder how the band had upgraded their equipment midweek or why the seating arrangement flowed so smoothly. People rarely question generosity when it benefits them. I watched my daughter-in-law glide through the room radiant and certain, greeting her family like a host who knew she belonged at the center of things. Her laughter rang louder now, reinforced by approval. The line she delivered earlier had landed exactly as intended. She had established the hierarchy. Everyone knew where I stood, except her father. I caught him watching me from across the room more than once. Each time our eyes met, he looked away first, not in shame, in calculation. The kind of look I'd seen on men who had just realized a meeting they thought they understood had taken a turn they couldn't control. Still, he didn't approach me. Neither did I seek him out. That would have been a mistake. Power explained, his power weakened. I have lived quietly by design for a long time. After my wife died, I learned the value of silence. Not the empty kind, but the disciplined kind. The kind that listens more than it speaks, that observes patterns instead of reacting to moments. I never introduced myself with titles or achievements. I didn't correct people when they assumed I was smaller than I was. Not because I lacked pride, but because pride that needs announcement is already unstable. I had hoped my son understood that. I had hoped he saw restraint as strength, not absence. But as the night wore on, it became harder to ignore where he placed himself. He stayed close to his wife, close to her family, close to the laughter that excluded me. When our eyes met, which wasn't often, he offered tight smiles that never quite reached his eyes. He didn't come over to check on me. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what had been said. He let it stand. That hurt more than the insult. Insults from strangers are cheap. Silence from your own child costs something else entirely. I replayed the months leading up to this evening in my mind, not as nostalgia, but as inventory. The quiet conversations, the careful distance, the way my son had spoken about the wedding in terms of logistics, not meaning. The way he'd accepted my help with a tone that suggested entitlement rather than gratitude. I had mistaken his comfort for closeness. I thought back to the first time he'd told me about her family. How impressed he sounded, how often he used words like accomplished, influential, established. I remembered how he'd laughed once and said, "Dad, you'd like them. They're very confident." At the time, I'd taken that as reassurance. Now I understood it as preparation. People had been told a story about me long before the wedding. A manageable story, a convenient story. One that made a public joke feel safe instead of dangerous. I excused myself to the edge of the room and stood there with a glass of water, watching couples dance under lights I had approved in a meeting weeks earlier. Everything was flawless. That was the irony. The night was exactly what it was supposed to be, except for the part where respect should have lived. I didn't feel anger rising in me. I felt something steadier. Assessment. I asked myself a simple question. If this is how they treat me when they believe I am powerless, how long have they been rehearsing it? I noticed then how easily assumptions travel. Once the first person frames you, everyone else adjusts their behavior to match. That's how reputations are built and destroyed without evidence. That's how cruelty becomes communal. And I realized something uncomfortable. My silence over the years had taught people how to treat me. Not because silence invites disrespect, but because silence without boundaries does. I had believed that stepping back would allow my son to step forward. That supporting without directing would allow him to grow. What I hadn't considered was that support without accountability can look like weakness to people who measure worth in dominance. I finished my water and set the glass down on a passing tray. The staff moved around me smoothly, professional and focused. They knew their roles. They knew who was responsible when something went wrong. They knew the cost of mistakes. Families, I had learned, often operate without that clarity. When the final song played and the crowd began to thin, I felt no urge to stay longer. I didn't seek out my son for a goodbye. I didn't pull my daughter-in-law aside to demand an explanation or apology. That would come later, if it came at all. I walked through the exit doors into the cool night air and took a slow breath. The city hummed around me, indifferent and steady. Somewhere behind me, laughter spilled out one last time before the doors closed. As I stood there, I understood the shape of what had happened. This wasn't about a single cruel sentence. It was about the version of me they found convenient. The version they had already accepted and repeated to one another until it felt true. They thought I was ordinary. They thought I was grateful to be included. They thought my generosity was evidence of insecurity rather than capacity. They thought wrong. I had allowed the misunderstanding to grow because correcting it had never mattered before. That night, it finally did. Not because I wanted revenge, but because clarity demands response. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. I didn't feel humiliated anymore. I felt awake. By the time I drove home, I knew something would change. Not in a dramatic public way, not with raised voices or ultimatums. Change doesn't need volume, it needs structure. They had mistaken my restraint for irrelevance. On Monday morning, they would learn the difference. People believe invisibility happens by accident. They imagine it as something imposed, a side effect of age or modesty or bad timing. The truth is simpler and far more deliberate. I learned early that the less you explain yourself, the more freedom you have to move. 18 months before my son's wedding, I was sitting alone in my home office reviewing reports that most people would have found dull enough to skim. I've always enjoyed the quiet parts of business, the places where numbers tell stories long before voices do. That evening, one particular set of figures refused to stay quiet. The company belonged to my future daughter-in-law's father, though I didn't know that at the time. All I saw was a business with a proud name, an impressive public reputation, and a structure that hadn't changed in decades. Revenue looked respectable on the surface. Assets were solid. But beneath that polish was complacency, inefficiency hidden by tradition, decisions made because that's how they'd always been made. Legacy can be a strength. It can also be a blindfold. I didn't pursue the company out of ambition or curiosity. I pursued it because the math didn't lie. Control was scattered. Shares were fragmented among relatives who treated ownership like inheritance rather than responsibility. No single voice truly governed the direction of the business. Everyone assumed someone else was paying attention. That assumption creates opportunity. I began quietly, not with announcements or meetings, but with patience. Minority stakes acquired through intermediaries, shares purchased when heirs wanted liquidity and didn't bother asking who was buying. Small moves that meant nothing on their own, but everything in accumulation. I never rushed. Speed draws attention. Patience draws results. I attended my first board meeting as a silent presence, invited as a courtesy, tolerated as an obligation. I was spoken over more than once. Ideas were dismissed because they didn't come from the right mouth. I watched, listened, and took notes. Not on paper, but in my head. Who deferred to whom? Who feared which cousin? Who had influence without authority and authority without competence? They thought I was symbolic, a figurehead, a widower filling time. I let them believe it. The more they underestimated me, the more freely they revealed themselves. Meetings ran long without conclusions. Decisions were postponed in favor of tradition. Family members occupied roles they neither understood nor respected. It wasn't malicious. It was comfortable. And comfort is dangerous in business. As the months passed, my position strengthened quietly. One share led to another. One vote tipped a committee. One recommendation placed a capable executive where a cousin used to sit. Every move was justified. Every action defensible. There was no coup, no conspiracy, just structure replacing assumption. The pivotal vote happened on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every visible way. The board gathered to discuss future leadership considerations, the kind of phrase that sounds harmless until it isn't. The current CEO had lost confidence internally. Results lagged. Pressure was building from investors who cared more about returns than bloodlines. When my name was put forward, the room hesitated. Someone laughed softly the way people do when they think a suggestion is symbolic. Someone else cleared their throat. Then the votes were counted. The decision was unanimous. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce anything. Legal authority was established. Contracts were signed. The transition plan was put in place, quietly scheduled to become public after the quarter closed. 1 week later, my son got married. I attended that wedding already holding the keys to a company my future in-laws believed they owned outright. And I said nothing. Not because I was hiding. Because the moment didn't belong to business. It belonged, or so I thought, to family. I believed then that power exercised too early can feel like punishment instead of correction. I believed restraint was a form of respect. Standing in that reception hall, while laughter rolled across the room, I realized how little restraint is valued by people who mistake silence for weakness. The irony didn't make me smile. It made me attentive. I thought back to the boardroom as the insult echoed in my ears, to the way my suggestions had once been ignored until someone else repeated them louder, to the way competence often waits patiently while confidence takes credit. The patterns were the same. Different room, same dynamic. I didn't acquire control to prove anything to anyone. I did it because the company deserved leadership based on reality, not nostalgia. Because employees deserved benefits instead of family indulgence. Because businesses that refuse to adapt eventually collapse under the weight of their own myths. The fact that this particular company belonged to my daughter-in-law's father was coincidence. Unfortunate for them. Clarifying for me. I understood then why her father had frozen when he saw me. Recognition doesn't always arrive as memory. Sometimes it arrives as instinct. As a sudden awareness that a familiar name has stepped out of the background and into focus. He knew what was coming, or at least he knew enough to be afraid. I had chosen not to confront anyone at the wedding, because confrontation would have turned the story into a spectacle. Spectacles satisfy egos, but solve nothing. Structure, on the other hand, doesn't need witnesses. By the time I drove home that night, my mind was already shifting forward. Monday morning would arrive, whether anyone was ready or not. Systems would begin to move. Reviews would be initiated. Questions would be asked that had been postponed for years. Not out of spite, out of necessity. The power I held wasn't loud. It didn't shout back at insults or demand apologies under chandeliers. It waited patient and grounded until the place where it mattered most. In the quiet of my house, I sat down and looked at my calendar. Meetings scheduled, calls queued, decisions prepared. Life continuing as it always does, regardless of emotion. I thought of my son asleep beside his new wife, unaware of how many illusions would be tested in the coming days. I thought of the man who had laughed until he recognized me. I thought of the version of myself everyone had agreed to believe in, because it made their world simpler. They would have their simplicity for one more weekend. By Monday morning, clarity would begin its work. I woke before dawn on the day of my son's wedding, the way I always do when something matters more than sleep. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles when decisions have already been made, and there's nothing left to debate. I brewed coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the sky lighten slowly, thinking about how many mornings I had done this alone since his mother died. I didn't feel sad that morning. I felt focused. The wedding wasn't until late afternoon, but there were details to confirm, calls to return, small fires to put out before they became visible. I had learned long ago that events don't run smoothly by accident. They run smoothly because someone absorbs the chaos before it reaches the room. By mid-morning, my phone had already buzzed with questions from the venue manager, the florist, the transportation coordinator. Each one spoke to me with the same calm efficiency I'd come to expect, because they knew who handled decisions, not because I demanded it. Because I responded when things mattered. I never told my future in-laws that I was paying for the wedding. I didn't announce it. I didn't negotiate credit. When my son came to me months earlier, uncertain and hopeful, I listened. He talked about her dreams, about expectations, about how important it was to her family that the day be done properly. I wrote the checks quietly. I told myself that this was what fathers do. That support given without conditions was love in its purest form. I believed that if I stayed in the background, my son would step into the center with confidence. I arrived at the venue early, long before the guests. The staff moved with purpose, checking place settings, adjusting lighting, rehearsing transitions. I walked through the space slowly, nodding when someone asked a question, answering without hesitation. Everything looked right, elegant without excess, thoughtful without spectacle. It occurred to me then that the room reflected my intentions perfectly, understated. controlled, designed to function without drawing attention to its foundation. By early afternoon, my son arrived nervous and distracted, his tie crooked, his smile tight. I helped him straighten it in a quiet room away from the noise. For a moment, it was just the two of us, like it had been so many times before. Just father and son preparing for something unknown. "You did good," I told him, adjusting his collar. "Your mother would be proud." He nodded, eyes flicking to his phone, then back to the mirror. He thanked me, but the words felt rehearsed, like something he'd practiced saying because it was expected. There was affection there, but also distance. A layer of something unspoken. I didn't push. Weddings are not the place for reckoning. As the ceremony approached, I took my seat quietly. Not in the front row, not positioned for recognition. I watched my son walk down the aisle with a posture that suggested confidence, even if his shoulders were tense. I watched his bride enter to a swell of admiration, radiant and assured, surrounded by the gravity of her family's approval. The ceremony was flawless. Vows exchanged, tears shed, applause earned. I clapped along with everyone else, my heart full in the way it always is when you see someone you love step into a future you can't control. If the day had ended, there perhaps none of what followed would have mattered. The reception unfolded like a magazine spread come to life. Guests mingled. Laughter floated. Compliments flowed freely. I stayed near the edges, greeting people politely when approached, otherwise content to observe. I had learned that observation reveals more than participation ever does. I noticed how introductions were handled, how I was framed. "This is my husband's father," my daughter-in-law said at one point, smiling brightly, already turning away before anyone could ask a question. Others described me as reserved, old-fashioned quiet. Someone said I'd done well for myself, the way people do when they're guessing. No one mentioned that I had paid for the venue they were standing in, or the meal they were enjoying, or the band they were complimenting. And I didn't correct them. I believed then that generosity should be invisible. As the evening wore on, the distance between my son and me became more apparent. He moved easily among her family, laughing at stories I hadn't heard, responding to cues I didn't recognize. When he passed me, it was with a quick squeeze of the shoulder, a gesture meant to reassure without lingering. I told myself this was normal, that he was building a new center of gravity, that stepping back was part of letting go. But something about the ease with which he let me remain peripheral unsettled me. I had raised him to be kind, to be grateful, to understand the difference between confidence and entitlement. Standing there watching him mirror the energy of people who treated me as optional, I wondered when that lesson had shifted. I replayed the conversations from the months leading up to the wedding. How he'd spoken about her family with admiration edged with anxiety. How often he'd used phrases like, "They're very successful and they expect a certain standard." How he'd brushed off my questions about logistics and finances with reassurances that everything was handled. Handled by me, as it turned out. The realization didn't anger me. It clarified something I had avoided acknowledging. I had allowed myself to become a resource rather than a presence. A solution rather than a voice. When the moment of humiliation came later, it didn't feel sudden. It felt prepared, as if the stage had been set carefully throughout the night. Each small dismissal contributing to the confidence with which she delivered that line. I understood then that the insult wasn't the beginning. It was the reveal. After it happened, after the laughter and the freeze and the uneasy recovery, I stayed long enough to ensure everything concluded smoothly. That was habit. Responsibility doesn't disappear just because dignity is bruised. But as I stood there watching staff dismantle a night I had built from the ground up, something hardened inside me. I had given freely. I had asked for nothing. And I had been positioned as expendable. Generosity, I realized, doesn't protect you from being diminished. It only magnifies the disrespect when it comes. When I finally left the venue, I didn't feel defeated. I felt informed. The wedding had shown me exactly where I stood in the story they had written. Not as a contributor, not as a father to be honored, but as a tolerated inconvenience. That clarity stayed with me all the way home. It sat beside me as I set my keys down and turned off the lights. It followed me into sleep and waited patiently when I woke. They had laughed because they believed there would be no cost. They were wrong about that too. The moment didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived the way storms do, when you've learned to read the air, subtle at first, inevitable once you recognize the signs. The reception had reached that familiar peak where structure loosens. Jackets were unbuttoned. Champagne had replaced wine. Conversations grew louder, edges softer. People leaned in closer to be heard, to be seen. Attention drifted toward whoever stood nearest the center. My daughter-in-law stepped into that space as if it belonged to her. Not nervously, not hesitantly, confidently, with the ease of someone accustomed to being applauded for speaking. She lifted her glass, waited for the room to quiet, and smiled. I felt the shift before she spoke. The way bodies angled. The way laughter paused in anticipation. This wasn't an interruption. It was a cue. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice warm and amused, "I'd like you to meet the old fat pig we have to put up with." The sentence landed cleanly. Too cleanly. It was delivered like a punchline everyone had already agreed was funny. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the laughter erupted. Not scattered. Unified. Loud. Confident. Approval rolling across the room in waves. Heads tipped back. Hands slapped tables. A few people glanced at me, then quickly away, as if my presence were an inconvenience they hadn't planned for. I stood exactly where I was. I didn't feel heat rush to my face. I didn't feel my pulse spike. What I felt instead was a cold clarity, the kind that arrives when something you suspected is finally confirmed. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't nerves. This was rehearsal rewarded. The words themselves mattered less than the ease with which they were received. I watched faces as the laughter continued. Her mother laughed first, and longest, eyes bright with satisfaction. A cluster of cousins followed, eager and loud. A few business associates laughed, half a beat late, checking reactions before committing. Others smiled thinly, uncomfortable but unwilling to be the first to object. I noticed who didn't laugh. Her father's smile cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes fixed on me wide with something that looked suspiciously like fear. Our gazes met across the room. Recognition doesn't always come with memory. Sometimes it comes with instinct. With a sudden understanding that the ground you're standing on is not as solid as you believed. He knew who I was. The laughter began to falter just slightly as people sensed something was off, not enough to stop, but enough to introduce uncertainty. Someone coughed. Someone clapped, trying to keep the energy up. The band hesitated, then resumed playing a fraction too loud. My daughter-in-law kept smiling, basking in the response. She hadn't noticed her father yet. She was too busy enjoying the validation. I did nothing. I didn't correct her. I didn't step forward. I didn't speak. That silence unsettled the room more than any reaction would have. People expect outrage. They expect embarrassment. They know how to handle defenses. They don't know what to do with stillness. I felt my son beside her, rigid and pale. His eyes flicked toward me for a brief moment, then away again. He didn't laugh. He didn't intervene. He stood frozen, caught between worlds, choosing neither. That choice hurt more than the insult ever could. The laughter tapered off awkwardly, dissolving into scattered claps and murmurs. Someone shouted cheers with forced enthusiasm. Glasses were raised. The moment was declared over by collective agreement. But it wasn't. I remained standing, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed. I let my silence sit in the space where their certainty had been. Her father slowly lowered his glass. He didn't speak to anyone near him. He didn't approach me. He took a step back, then another, retreating, as if proximity itself had become dangerous. He knew what Monday morning meant. The rest of the room didn't. Not yet. The music grew louder, the band overcompensating for the tension. Conversations restarted, slightly strained at first, then smoothing over as people convinced themselves that nothing serious had occurred. Laughter returned in smaller doses, less confident now, but still present. Cruelty, I've learned, relies on momentum. Once the moment passes, people move on quickly, grateful not to be the target. I accepted congratulations from a man who had laughed moments earlier. I thanked a woman who wouldn't meet my eyes. I nodded politely at someone who patted my arm and said, "All in good fun, right?" I didn't answer. Her father avoided me for the rest of the night. He spoke briefly with the venue manager, then left early, citing a headache. His departure went largely unnoticed, but I watched him go with interest. Men don't leave their daughter's wedding early without reason. I stayed until the end. That surprised people later, too. They expected me to vanish, to sulk, to make a statement by absence. Instead, I stayed calm and present, ensuring that nothing else went wrong. That's the thing about responsibility. It doesn't disappear when you're insulted. When the final song played and guests began to drift toward the exits, the room felt hollowed out. Decorations remained, but the energy was gone. What had been exposed couldn't be unexposed. My daughter-in-law avoided me then. No eye contact, no follow-up joke, no apology. She had sensed finally that something hadn't landed the way she expected. Confidence drained quickly when the approval she relied on wavered. My son approached me briefly, his voice low and strained. He said my name, then stopped as if unsure what came next. I looked at him and waited. He said nothing. I nodded once and turned away. I stepped outside into the night air and took a long breath. The city hummed around me, steady and indifferent. Somewhere behind me, laughter echoed one last time before the doors closed. I didn't feel angry. I felt resolved. I understood then that respect is not something you demand in moments of heat. It's something you enforce through structure, through consequences that don't need explanation. The insult was finished. The response had already begun. Monday morning would arrive quietly without chandeliers or champagne. There would be no audience, no laughter. Just systems moving into alignment, indifferent to intention, unforgiving of arrogance. They had enjoyed their joke. Now it was my turn to do my job. Monday morning did not feel dramatic. It felt surgical. The city was still waking up when I stepped out of my car and into the mirrored lobby of Ardent Financial Group, the company that had quietly absorbed my daughter-in-law's father's empire 6 weeks earlier. The deal had been finalized without press, without ceremony, without his family's awareness. They believed I was an external advisor, a consultant, temporary. They were wrong. I nodded to the security desk. The guard straightened immediately, recognition flickering across his face. He knew who signed his payroll checks. Power, when real, doesn't need announcing. It's felt. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent. No music, no chatter. Just the soft hum of machinery lifting me upward, floor by floor, toward consequences that had been delayed long enough. When the doors opened, my assistant was already waiting. Calm, efficient, prepared. "Good morning, Elias," she said. "The boardroom is ready. Legal is on standby. Human Resources has finalized the documentation you requested." "Thank you," I replied. "Let's begin." The boardroom filled slowly. Men and women in tailored suits took their seats with the careful politeness of people who sense the ground shifting beneath them. Some smiled professionally. Some avoided my eyes. One or two looked irritated, as if inconvenienced by a meeting they hadn't scheduled. And then he walked in. My daughter-in-law's father hesitated at the doorway, just long enough for me to notice. He scanned the room, calculating, searching for familiar hierarchies. When his eyes landed on me at the head of the table, his jaw tightened. He took his seat without greeting me. That told me everything I needed to know. Let's get started, I said, folding my hands calmly on the table. We have a full agenda. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't need to. The first item was operational restructuring. Numbers appeared on the screen behind me. Clear, precise, unforgiving. We'll begin with executive compensation, I continued. Effective immediately, all leadership salaries will be aligned with performance metrics. Legacy bonuses tied to tenure rather than output will be discontinued. A murmur rippled through the room. He leaned forward. Elias, with all due respect, these compensation structures were approved years ago. Yes, I said evenly. By a board that no longer exists. Silence. I clicked to the next slide. Second, family-based appointments. As of today, all roles occupied by relatives without verifiable qualifications will be subject to review. Some positions will be eliminated entirely. His face flushed. You can't just remove people who built this company. They didn't build it, I said. They inherited proximity. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. No one contradicted me. Third, I continued employee benefits. Healthcare coverage will be expanded. Retirement matching will be increased. Transparent promotion pathways will replace discretionary favoritism. One of the directors spoke up. That will increase overhead significantly. Yes, I replied. And decrease turnover, legal exposure, and reputational risk. Long-term, it improves profitability. Short-term, it improves morality. He scoffed, quietly. But I heard it. I turned to him then. Do you have an objection? He cleared his throat. I have concerns about the speed of these changes. This company has traditions. Traditions are not contracts, I said. And stagnation is not stability. I let that settle before continuing. Finally, I said, conflict of interest policies. Effective today, no board member or executive may leverage their position for personal or familial gain. Violations will result in immediate termination. That was when the fear became visible. He looked around the room, searching for allies. He found none. These measures are aggressive, he said carefully. They could destabilize internal relationships. I smiled then, just slightly. Internal relationships that rely on silence and entitlement deserve destabilization. The vote was a formality. My controlling interest made it unnecessary, but procedure matters. Power that ignores process breeds resentment. Power that respects it breeds compliance. Every motion passed. When the meeting adjourned, people stood slowly gathering their papers, with the distracted movements of individuals recalibrating their futures. Some nodded to me respectfully. Others avoided me altogether. He remained seated. I waited. When the room finally cleared, he looked up at me, the mask gone now. You did this because of the wedding, he said. I considered that for a moment. No, I replied. I did this because of what the wedding revealed. He stood, anger breaking through his composure. My daughter made a tasteless joke. That doesn't justify dismantling an entire leadership structure. It wasn't a joke, I said calmly. It was a belief spoken aloud, and beliefs inform behavior. You're punishing my family. I'm correcting a system, I said. Your family benefited from that system disproportionately. That's not punishment. That's consequence. He clenched his fists. You could have spoken to me privately. I did, I said, with my silence. He stared at me, realization dawning too late. You humiliated me, he said quietly. I met his gaze without flinching. You laughed while someone humiliated me publicly. This is the cost of that moment. He had nothing left to say. Neither did I. By noon, the changes were already rippling outward. Emails sent, meetings scheduled, rumors spreading. The company exhaled confused, but curious. Employees noticed. They always do. When fairness enters a system, even briefly, people feel it. My phone buzzed once. A message from my son, Dad. Sophia's father is furious. He says you blindsided him. Can we talk? I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then I typed back. We will. Soon. I put the phone down and leaned back in my chair looking out over the city. Power had a weight to it. Not heavy exactly, but dense. It required steadiness, intent. I thought of the laughter at the wedding, the ease with which cruelty had been shared like a private language. I thought of my son standing silent beside it. This wasn't revenge. This was alignment. Systems correcting themselves when truth is introduced. By the end of the day, the company would be different. Leaner, fairer, less comfortable for those who mistook entitlement for immunity. And tonight, when I went home, I would sit alone with a glass of water and the understanding that the most painful reckoning still waited ahead. Because dismantling a corporation is easier than confronting the child you raised, and that conversation was coming. The call from my son came that evening, later than usual after the city lights had softened and the day's adrenaline had drained away. Dad, he said, voice tight, controlled in the way people get when they're trying not to sound emotional. Sophia's not okay. Her parents are spiraling. She says everything is falling apart. I didn't answer right away. I stood by the window of my apartment watching headlights crawl along the avenue below like nervous thoughts that couldn't find a place to rest. Are you coming over? He asked. I think it's time we talked, I said. Just you and me. Silence. Then a breath. About what? About everything, I replied. Come tomorrow morning, 9. He agreed too quickly, the way children do when they sense they don't have leverage. That night, sleep came in fragments. Not because I was anxious about the meeting, but because memory has a way of surfacing when you finally stop distracting yourself with momentum. I found myself thinking about his childhood, about the quiet mornings when I packed his lunch, while reviewing market reports about teaching him the difference between price and value. I wondered when that lesson had been lost. He arrived precisely on time. My son looked older than he had at the wedding, less polished. The confidence he wore so easily in front of Sophia's family was gone, replaced by something brittle and defensive. He hugged me stiffly, as if unsure whether affection was still permitted. We sat across from each other at the dining table. No coffee, no small talk. Dad, he began, I need you to understand something. You've put me in an impossible position. I nodded. Go on. Sophia's father might lose his job. Her family's reputation is in question. People are talking. They're saying you're retaliating. People, I said calmly, often confuse accountability with retaliation when they're not used to consequences. He frowned. That's exactly what I mean. You're proving everything she said about you. I felt that land sharp and unexpected. Everything she said about me, I repeated. That you use power and money to control situations, he said, leaning forward now. That you don't let things go. That you make everything a test. I studied him carefully then. Not as a father, as a man. Tell me, I said quietly, when did I test you? He hesitated. You paid for the wedding. You paid for my education. You've always been there financially. It makes it hard to feel independent. So you accepted my help, I said, and resented me for offering it. That's not fair. It's precise, I replied. He stood up, pacing. You don't know what it's like being around her family. They judge everything. They look at you like you're a resume. I didn't want to look like a man who needed his father. And yet I said you needed your father. He stopped pacing. I just wanted to be enough, he said softly. For her. I let the silence stretch. Do you know what she said to me after the wedding, I asked? He looked away. She told me. Did she tell you why she felt comfortable saying it? I pressed. He shrugged. She said she was nervous. That it came out wrong. That's not what she told me, I said. He looked up sharply. You spoke to her. Yes. When, after the laughter, I said, after your silence. His jaw tightened. What else did she say, he asked. That she believed I was controlling, I said. Manipulative, that I used money to stay relevant in your life. His shoulders sagged just slightly. And where do you think she got that idea, I asked. He didn't answer. I stood, then walked to the sideboard and poured a glass of water. My hands were steady. You didn't correct her, I continued. You didn't defend me. Which means some part of you agreed. That's not true, he said quickly. Then tell me, I said, turning back to face him, why didn't you stop her? He swallowed. I didn't think it would go that far. But you thought it, I said. That's the difference. His voice cracked. I didn't mean to make you the villain. But you did, I said. Because it was easier than admitting you were ashamed of needing me. He sat back down heavily. I love you, he said. You know that. I do, I replied. But love without respect corrodes. He rubbed his face with his hands. So what now? Are you cutting us off financially? I considered him for a long moment. Yes, I said. His head snapped up. You can't be serious. I am, I replied. Not out of spite, out of necessity. We just got married, he said. We're building a life, and a life built on resentment is unstable, I said. You wanted independence. I'm giving it to you. He stood again, anger flaring. This is extreme. No, I said. This is overdue. You're punishing me for one mistake. I'm responding to a pattern, I said calmly. Years of quiet distancing, of taking support while undermining the person providing it. He laughed bitterly. So that's it. You're choosing your pride over your son. I stepped closer to him, then close enough that he had to meet my eyes. I'm choosing my dignity, I said. And you should start choosing yours. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. What about Sophia, he asked. She apologized. She did, I acknowledged. Sincerely, then why isn't that enough? Because she apologized for the insult, I said, not for the belief that allowed it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. You told her I was controlling? I continued. You primed her family to see me as something to tolerate. That didn't come from nowhere. He sat down slowly, deflated. I didn't think it mattered, he said quietly. That, I replied, is the problem. I walked back to my seat, but I didn't sit. I won't interfere in your marriage, I said. I won't manipulate outcomes. But I also won't finance a life that resents me. He nodded numbly. And the company, he asked. Her father's job. That has nothing to do with you, I said, and everything to do with competence. He looked up. You're really not backing down. No, I said. I'm standing still. He stared at the table for a long time. What do I do? He asked finally. You grow, I said, without leaning on me, without hiding behind me, without resenting me. He stood, walked toward the door, then turned back. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said. I know, I replied. But intent doesn't erase impact. After he left, I remained standing in the quiet apartment, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. Boundaries had been drawn, not with anger, with resolve. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting to be understood. I was simply done explaining myself. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in through cracks I hadn't known were there, quiet and relentless. By midweek, the company had settled into a strange new rhythm. Meetings were sharper. Emails were shorter. People spoke with intention instead of habit. The old comfort of assumed immunity was gone, replaced by a cautious alertness that told me the message had landed. But it wasn't the office that unsettled me. It was the silence from my son. 2 days passed without a word. No call, no text, no attempt to negotiate or soften what I'd said. That worried me more than anger ever could. Silence in families is rarely peace. It's regrouping. The call came Thursday night. It wasn't him. It was her. "Mr. Ward," she said, voice tight and brittle. "This is Sophia. I know this is late, but I was hoping we could talk privately." I looked at the clock. Just after 10. "Yes," I said. "Come tomorrow morning." 10. She arrived alone. That surprised me. I'd expected an entourage, or at least my son hovering nearby, ready to manage the conversation. Instead, she stood in my doorway with a purse clutched too tightly, eyes red but focused. She looked smaller than she had at the wedding, less polished, less certain. I gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "I won't take much of your time," she said quickly. "I just need to understand what's happening." "Sit," I repeated gently. She did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, not hostile, but heavy with unspoken truths. "I owe you an apology," she began, again, and not the kind that's meant to smooth things over. I waited. "What I said at the wedding," she continued, "it wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. And I need to own that. That was new." She took a breath. "I believed what I said. About you. I believed you were someone we had to manage, endure. I thought your money came with strings. And now I asked. Now I realize I was wrong," she said. "But more than that, I realize I was told a version of you that wasn't true." I leaned back slightly. By whom, I asked, though I already knew. Her jaw tightened. "By your son." The words didn't shock me. They confirmed. "He told me you were generous," she said, "but controlling, that you used financial help to stay involved, that you didn't know when to step back. And you believed him." "Yes," she said quietly, "because I wanted to. I appreciated the honesty. Why, I asked." She hesitated, then met my eyes. "Because it made me feel less guilty about accepting your help." There it was. "My family doesn't respect dependence," she continued. "They value appearances, independence, power. I wanted to believe that accepting your generosity didn't mean we owed you respect." I nodded slowly. "And when you introduced me that way, I said you were signaling to them that I had no leverage." "Yes," she admitted. "I thought if I minimized you, they would feel comfortable. And if they felt comfortable, I would feel secure." Silence settled between us again. "And how did that work out?" I asked. Her laugh was short and bitter, disastrously. She wiped her eyes. "My father is furious. Not just about the company, about me. He says I humiliated him by not knowing who you were." "Interesting," I said. "Not that you humiliated me." She flinched. "He says the mistake wasn't the insult," she went on. "It was misjudging power." I sighed softly. "And what do you think?" I asked. She looked down at her hands. "I think the mistake was thinking power was the point." That surprised me. She looked back up. "I didn't grow up learning respect the way you did. I learned strategy, optics, how to position myself. I thought that made me strong. And now," I prompted. "And now I realize I was weak," she said, "because I couldn't tolerate being the smaller person in the room." I studied her face. The confidence was gone. In its place was something rawer, not just remorse, reckoning. "My marriage is in trouble," she said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "He told me you cut him off financially," she said, "that you're forcing him to stand on his own." "Yes," I repeated. She nodded. "He's angry, scared, and resentful." "Of me?" I asked. "Of you," she said, "and of himself." She hesitated. "I didn't realize how much he resented needing you." "That resentment didn't start with me," I said. "It started with who he wanted to be and wasn't yet." She nodded slowly. "I'm not here to ask you to reverse anything," she said. "I know better than that. I'm here because I need to decide what kind of woman I'm going to be moving forward." I listened. "I can defend him," she said, "make excuses, blame the pressure, or I can tell the truth." And what is the truth, I asked. That he let me disrespect you, she said, and that I enjoyed it because it made me feel powerful. The admission hung in the air. I don't expect forgiveness, she added quickly, but I want you to know that I see it now, and I won't repeat it. I considered her carefully. Respect, I said finally, isn't proven in apologies. It's proven in behavior when it costs you something. She nodded. I know. Your father's position, I continued, is not something I will negotiate through family channels. I understand, she said. And your marriage, I added, is not something I will intervene in. She swallowed. Even if it falls apart? Especially if it falls apart, I said gently. I won't be the reason you stay or leave. She exhaled shakily. I didn't expect you to be kind, she admitted. I'm not being kind, I replied. I'm being clear. She stood then, smoothing her coat as if grounding herself. One more thing, she said. My family thinks you're doing this out of revenge. I met her gaze evenly. What do you think? I think you finally stopped shrinking yourself to keep others comfortable, she said. I nodded once. She walked to the door, then turned back. I won't call you that again, she said. Ever. Not to anyone. Not as a joke. Not as a story. That's a start, I said. After she left, I sat alone for a long time. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel softened. What I felt was something quieter. Alignment. The truth had begun moving on its own, no longer needing my force to propel it. Later that evening, my son texted. She spoke to you, didn't she? Yes, I replied. Another pause. What did she say? That she's learning, I typed. Just like you are. The typing bubble appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I don't know if I can do this alone, Dad. I stared at the message, then set the phone down without responding. Some lessons require silence to sink in, and some growth only happens when the safety net is finally gone. The first sign that the ground was truly shifting came from an unexpected place. It wasn't my son. It wasn't Sophia. It wasn't even her father. It was my attorney. He called early Friday morning, his voice measured in the way lawyers use when something has crossed from personal into procedural. Elias, he said, I need to ask you a few questions, and I need you to answer them very carefully. I sat down. When did you last review your son's financial accounts? He asked. I don't, I replied. I stopped monitoring his finances years ago. A pause. Papers shifting. Has he ever had signing authority on any of your accounts? Power of attorney? Access to your investment vehicles? No, I said immediately. Never. Another pause, longer this time. Then I need you to prepare yourself, he said, because something just surfaced during our internal audit at Ardent. The word audit tightened my chest. What kind of something, I asked. A personal loan application, he said. Filed 18 months ago. Substantial amount. Your name appears as co-signer. That's not possible, I said. I never signed, I know. He interrupted gently. The signature isn't yours. Silence settled around me, thick and heavy. Elias, he continued. The handwriting analysis is preliminary, but all indicators suggest it was forged. I closed my eyes. And the borrower, I asked, though I already knew. Your son. The world didn't spin. There was no dramatic rush of blood or ringing in my ears. What I felt instead was a slow, sinking realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a system, a habit. A line crossed once and then crossed again because no one stopped it. How much, I asked. Across multiple instruments, he said carefully, just under 100,000. I said nothing. There's more, he added. The funds weren't used for business development or education. They were used to service lifestyle debt, cars, travel, appearances. The line went quiet. Elias, he said finally, if the bank pursues this, they won't care that he's your son. They'll care that your name is on forged documents. We need to act quickly. I understand, I said. Thank you for telling me. After I hung up, I sat alone in my office for a long time. This wasn't about money. I could absorb the loss without consequence. That was never the issue. This was about trust, about the quiet, corrosive entitlement that grows when generosity goes unquestioned and accountability never arrives. I called my son. He answered on the second ring. "Dad," he said, voice already tight, "I was just about to call you." "Come over," I said. "Now." He arrived 20 minutes later, breathless and pale. He took one look at my face and knew the mask was gone. "You know," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I know." He didn't sit. He paced, running a hand through his hair. "I was going to tell you," he said quickly. "I just needed time to fix it." "You had 18 months," I said calmly. "And instead you forged my name." "I didn't think it would get this far," he said. "I thought once I got established, you thought wrong," I interrupted. He stopped pacing. "How many?" I asked. He hesitated. "How many loans?" I repeated. "3, he admitted. "And a line of credit." "And you never intended to tell me," I said. "I was going to pay it back," he insisted. "Once things stabilized." "Stabilized," I echoed. "By lying." He dropped into a chair, face in his hands. "I was drowning," he said quietly. "I couldn't keep up. Everyone around Sophia lives like money is oxygen. I didn't want to look weak." "So you committed fraud," I said, "and used my name to do it?" "I didn't think of it like that," he whispered. "That's because you've never had to think about consequences," I said. "I've always absorbed them for you." He looked up at me, then eyes red. "Are you going to turn me in?" he asked. The question landed harder than I expected. "I'm going to protect myself," I said. "And then we'll see what's left." He nodded, shoulders slumping. "I'll cooperate," he said. "With whatever you decide." That was the first responsible thing he'd said in years. We sat in silence for a moment. "Does Sophia know?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." "She will," I said. "Today." His head snapped up. "Dad, please." "She'll leave. That's not my decision," I replied. "But she doesn't get to build a life on falsehoods." He looked defeated. I called my attorney back and scheduled an emergency meeting. By noon, the truth was documented, confessions signed, a repayment plan drafted, counseling mandated, oversight imposed. I paid the debt, not because I wanted to save him, but because I refused to let his choices implicate me legally. The difference mattered. That afternoon, Sophia arrived. She had found the paperwork. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She sat across from me in my office, eyes hollow with shock. "Is it true?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She turned to my son. "You used his name," she said slowly. "You lied to me." "I was ashamed," he said. "I didn't want you to see me like this." "I married you," she replied. "Not the version you pretended to be." She stood. "I need space," she said, "and honesty. For once." She left without looking back. That evening, I walked through my apartment alone, the silence different now. Heavier, but also cleaner. The truth had finally surfaced, not as a weapon, as a reckoning. I realized then that the wedding insult hadn't been the beginning. It had been the fracture line. Everything that followed had already been there waiting for pressure. And pressure had finally arrived. The house felt unfamiliar with my son still inside it. He slept in the guest room that night, not because I asked him to, but because neither of us pretended the old boundaries still applied. Morning came quietly. No slammed doors, no accusations shouted across hallways, just the sound of the coffee machine humming like it always had, indifferent to family collapse. He joined me at the table without speaking. I slid a folder across the wood surface. He didn't open it right away. He already knew what was inside. This is the repayment structure, I said. It's strict, it's monitored, and it assumes you'll live very differently than you have been. He nodded once. I deserve that. You deserve accountability, I corrected. Not punishment. He flinched, then nodded again. Your salary from Ardent will go directly into the trust account, I continued. Housing, food, transportation. That's it. No discretionary spending. No image maintenance. No pretending. I understand, he said quietly. And counseling, I added. Mandatory, financial, and behavioral. I'll go, he said. I already looked up a provider. That surprised me. I studied him for a long moment. He looked exhausted. Smaller, somehow. The confidence he'd borrowed from proximity to wealth had evaporated, leaving behind the man he actually was. Good, I said. Because this doesn't work unless you're honest for once. He swallowed. Dad, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not offering it, I replied. Not yet. That hurt him more than anger would have. I could see it in his eyes. After breakfast, he left for work. Not in the expensive car he'd once flaunted, but in the modest sedan I'd insisted he trade down to as part of the agreement. He didn't argue. That alone told me the gravity had finally landed. By noon, my phone started ringing. Her father. I let it go to voicemail. Her mother. Ignored. A board member. Answered brief, professional. Then her again. Sophia's message was short. I need to talk. Today. Please. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Come by at 4. She arrived on time, eyes rimmed red but posture controlled. She'd always been good at containment, at presenting competence even when unraveling. I left him, she said before sitting down. I nodded. I assumed you might. I didn't leave because of the money, she said quickly, or your decisions. I left because I don't recognize the man I married. That's fair, I said. She clasped her hands tightly. My parents think you orchestrated this, that you set him up to fail. I met her gaze. Do you believe that? She shook her head. No, I think he was already failing. You just stopped covering it. That was the closest thing to an apology I needed. My father wants to meet, she continued. He thinks this can still be resolved, that you'll soften. I won't, I said. She exhaled shakily. I know. We sat in silence for a moment. I called you something unforgivable, she said finally. And then I built my life on assumptions that allowed me to justify it. I don't expect you to like me. I don't need to, I replied. I need you to understand why it mattered. She nodded. Because it revealed who I was when I thought no one important was watching. Exactly, I said. And now she asked. Now you decide who you become without leaning on inherited power, I said. Just like my son is learning. Her eyes filled again. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Strength isn't confidence, I said. It's humility under pressure. She left shortly after, quieter than when she arrived. That evening, her father showed up unannounced. Security called first. He's insisting, my assistant said. Says it's urgent. Send him up, I replied. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in a week. His confidence was gone, replaced by calculation, edged with desperation. You've destroyed my family, he said without preamble. No, I replied. I removed the illusion protecting it. You humiliated us, he snapped. Publicly. You laughed, while my dignity was treated as entertainment, I said calmly. That was public. He paced. My daughter is living with us again. My son-in-law is unraveling. My board doesn't trust me. That's called consequence, I said. You could fix this, he said. You could slow down the restructuring, reassign oversight, give my family time. Your family has had decades, I replied. He slammed his hand on the desk. You're doing this because she insulted you. I stood. I'm doing this because your family confused cruelty with superiority, I said, and my son confused dependence with entitlement. He stared at me, breathing hard. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want professionalism," I said, and silence where disrespect once lived. "You won't sell," he said, defeated. "No," I confirmed. He left without another word. That night my son called. "She left," he said. "She took a suitcase. She didn't yell." That somehow made it worse. "I know," I said. "I don't blame her," he continued. "I wouldn't want to be married to who I became." "That's the beginning of accountability," I said. He hesitated. "Do you think she'll come back?" "That's not the right question," I replied. "The right question is whether you'll still be someone worth returning to, if she does." Silence. "I'll try," he said finally. "Trying isn't enough," I said gently. "Changing is." After the call ended, I sat alone, the weight of it all settling into something quieter. The wedding insult had detonated a truth that could no longer be ignored. Power had shifted, masks had fallen, and for the first time, no one was asking me to smooth it over. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Time has a way of clarifying what emotion cannot. By the following week, the chaos had settled into something more honest. Not peace, not resolution, just truth standing where denial used to be. At the office, the restructuring moved forward without resistance. The people who belonged stayed. The people who coasted left. Productivity rose quietly without fanfare. Employees stopped whispering in hallways and started speaking in meetings. When fear is removed from a system, competence has room to breathe. I noticed it in small ways. Fewer interruptions, clearer decisions. No one laughing at someone else's expense. Respect when enforced changes the air. My son kept his distance. That was intentional, part of the agreement. No emotional shortcuts, no appeals to nostalgia. He showed up to work early, stayed late, and said little. He listened more than he spoke. When he made mistakes, he corrected them without defensiveness. It was the first time I had seen him uncomfortable without resenting me for it. One afternoon, my assistant informed me that he'd declined an invitation to a company-sponsored event. He said he wasn't ready for that environment, she told me. I nodded. That mattered more than any apology. Sophia remained silent. No messages, no indirect overtures, no attempts to recruit me as an ally against my own son. I respected that. Distance can be a form of dignity when it's chosen honestly. Her parents, on the other hand, continued to test boundaries. Emails disguised as inquiries. Calls framed as concerns. Invitations phrased like obligations. I declined them all. Eventually, the messages stopped. People learn quickly when access is revoked. The real reckoning came on a quiet Sunday morning. I was reading at the kitchen table when the doorbell rang. I hadn't been expecting anyone. I opened the door to find my son standing there holding a small box. "I won't stay long," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He placed the box on the table and didn't sit. His posture was different now. Straighter. Less performative. "I wanted to return something," he said. I opened the box. Inside was the watch I'd given him the day he graduated. A modest piece. Well made, no logo. He'd worn it every day since. "You don't have to do this," I said. "I do," he replied. "Not because you asked, because I need to understand what I've been taking without earning." I closed the box gently. He swallowed. "I've started therapy." I nodded. "And I sold the car," he added, "bought something cheaper. I moved into a smaller place." "Good," I said. He hesitated, then met my eyes. "I blamed you because it was easier than admitting I was scared," he said. "Scared I wasn't enough on my own." "That fear," I replied, "doesn't make you weak. Avoiding it does." He nodded slowly. "I don't expect us to be close again," he said. "Not anytime soon. But I wanted you to know. I'm not running anymore." "That's all I need to know," I said. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. She's filed for a separation, he said quietly. I felt the weight of that settle, but I didn't react. She deserves clarity, I said. Whatever form that takes. He nodded. I know. After he left, I sat alone for a long time. I didn't feel grief the way people expected. I felt release. The kind that comes when a long, exhausting role finally ends. I wasn't his shield anymore. I was his mirror. That week, the board approved the final phase of reform. Family privileges were officially dismantled. Performance benchmarks replaced assumptions. The company, once bloated with entitlement, now stood lean and accountable. I received messages from employees I'd never met, thanking me for changes that should have existed long before I arrived. One message stood out. My daughter-in-law's father submitted his resignation. No explanation, no farewell tour. Just a formal letter and a cleared office. I accepted it without comment. That night, I poured myself a drink and stood by the window watching the city move. Lights on, lights off. People making choices visible and invisible. The wedding felt like a lifetime ago. The insult that had sparked all of this now seemed small. Not because it wasn't cruel, but because it had done its job. It exposed rot. It forced truth into daylight. And truth once revealed doesn't care who it embarrasses. I thought about the version of myself I'd been before that night. Quiet, accommodating, careful not to take up too much space even when I'd earned it. That man had believed that love required endurance. This man understood that love requires boundaries. My phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. I stared at the name for a long moment before opening it. Thank you for not interfering. I didn't understand what respect meant until I lost it. I'm learning now, I typed back. Learning is the only thing that matters. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, I felt something settle that had been restless for years. I hadn't won. I had stopped losing myself. And for the first time in a very long while, that was enough. The quiet that followed felt earned. Not empty, not lonely. Earned the way silence feels, after truth has finally been spoken without apology. Weeks passed. Not dramatically, not cinematically. Life continued the way it always does when you stop trying to control how it looks from the outside. Mornings came, work progressed. Decisions were made without asking who might be offended by them. Ardent Financial stabilized into something healthier than it had ever been. Not kinder, fairer. People knew where they stood. Performance replaced pedigree. Accountability replaced entitlement. When employees spoke to me now, they spoke plainly. No flattery, no fear. That told me everything. My son kept his distance, but it was a different kind of distance now. Not avoidance, respect. He sent short updates through my assistant, completed milestones, therapy appointments kept, debts paid on schedule, no emotional appeals tucked between numbers. I didn't praise him. Growth doesn't need applause to be real. Sophia finalized the separation quietly. No public drama, no blame campaigns. She moved forward the same way she had learned to do everything else in her life, deliberately and alone. I heard through others that she had taken a position outside her family's orbit, earned it, stayed late, asked questions instead of issuing directives. I hoped she would remember what it felt like to be humbled before she ever felt powerful again. As for me, something subtle but permanent had shifted. I no longer felt the need to explain myself. At dinners, when people asked about my son, I answered honestly but briefly. When they asked about the wedding, I smiled and changed the subject. I stopped carrying the weight of other people's discomfort. It wasn't mine to hold. One evening, months later, I found myself back at the same venue where the wedding had taken place. Not by design. A charity event. Different crowd, same room. The chandeliers still glittered, the floors still shone. But the air felt different. I stood near the back unnoticed, watching conversations unfold. Watching how easily people laughed when they believed they were safe. watching who listened and who performed. A woman near me whispered something unkind about another guest's appearance. Her friend laughed reflexively, then caught my eye and stopped. The laughter died awkwardly. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Respect once established has a radius. As the evening wound down, someone asked me if I wanted to speak, offer remarks, share wisdom. I declined, not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood that my worth didn't require a microphone. When I got home that night, I poured a glass of water and sat by the window watching the city breathe. Lights blinking, cars passing, lives intersecting briefly before moving on. I thought about the man I'd been at the beginning of this story. The one who stood quietly while being humiliated, believing restraint was dignity. I had been wrong. Dignity isn't silence in the face of disrespect. It's choosing not to internalize it. I didn't regret what I'd done. Not the restructuring, not the boundaries, not even the pain. Pain is sometimes the only honest teacher. What I regretted was how long I had waited. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Being generous does not require being small. Loving someone does not require tolerating their contempt. And power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself when someone tries to diminish you and fails. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel invisible in a room you helped build, if you've ever paid the price for peace while others enjoyed the comfort of your silence, know this. It's not too late to stop shrinking. It's not too late to draw a line. And it's never wrong to demand respect, especially from the people who benefit most from your presence. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever stayed quiet when you shouldn't have? Or drawn a boundary that changed everything? Share it in the comments. You're not alone in this. And if you want more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, hidden power, and the moment tables finally turn, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel and join the conversation. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's living with clarity and never apologizing for it again.